Two men, same season, same frozen ground under the same Yukon sky. But by the time the wash plants shut down for winter, one of them was standing next to a pile of gold worth tens of millions of dollars, and the other was standing next to idle machines, watching his claim get shut down while the clock on his entire season ran out. This isn't a story someone made up to get your attention. This actually happened. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how one man's ground turned into one of the richest hauls of his career, while a few valleys away, another man's ground turned into his biggest nightmare. Stay with me, because the twist at the halfway point of this story is the part almost nobody talks about. Parker Schnabel didn't wake up one morning and stumble into a fortune. That's not how it works. And if you followed his career, you already know that. Every season, before a single bucket of dirt gets moved, Parker and his team spend weeks going back over drill data, old sample reports, and ground they've either mined before or scouted years earlier. This season was no different. He was chasing a personal goal of 10,000 ounces, a number that would have sounded almost impossible for most operations in the Klondike, but not impossible for a crew running 4 wash plants at once. That's the detail people forget. Parker wasn't relying on one lucky pit. He had multiple sites running simultaneously at Dominion Creek and beyond, each one with its own crew, its own foreman, its own daily numbers being tracked back at camp. Early in the season, the numbers weren't overwhelming. They were solid, but nothing that suggested a record was coming. Then wildfires tore through the Yukon. More than 90 separate fires burning across 250,000 acres, some of them creeping close enough to camp that operations had to be paused entirely. For a few tense days, it looked like smoke and flame might do what competitors never could, slow Parker down before he even got going. But the fires passed, the crews got back to work, and the gold kept adding up week after week. By the middle of the season, Parker was closing in on 5,000 ounces, roughly halfway to his goal, and the gold price was climbing right alongside the ounce count. That combination, more gold and a higher price per ounce, is exactly the kind of multiplier that turns a good season into a legendary one. Still, nothing about this run was accidental. When yields started dipping in certain areas, Parker made the call to shut down some of his wash plants entirely and pour everything into clearing what his crew called the Golden Mile. That's a real decision, and it's a risky one. Shutting down active plants to focus resources somewhere else means betting that the ground ahead is better than the ground you're walking away from. If he'd been wrong, it could have cost him weeks of production during the shortest mining season on Earth. He wasn't wrong. Around the same stretch of the season, Parker brought in new equipment to back up the gamble, including a brand new dozer worth roughly $4 million on its own, plus a new wash plant his team affectionately nicknamed Gigi, short for Golden Goose. The name turned out to be fitting. With more horsepower and more processing capacity in the ground, the ounces started climbing faster than almost anyone on the crew expected. By the time the wash plants stopped running for the season, Parker had blown past his 10,000-ounce target, with a final season value reported at somewhere around $42 million. That number alone puts it among the biggest hauls in the history of the show. But here's the part that makes it even more interesting. Parker wasn't the only one having a monster year. Tony Beets, the veteran everyone calls the king of the Klondike, was chasing him the entire time. Beets started the season with a goal of 6,500 ounces, a number that looked ambitious in January and looked conservative by April. His crew kept closing the gap, week after week, until at one point only a few hundred ounces separated the two operations, both of them already past 10,000 ounces individually. By the finale, Tony Beets edged ahead with a final total of 11,231 ounces, worth an estimated $45 million, enough to reclaim his title for the season. Picture that for a second. Two of the biggest names in placer mining, both clearing $40 million or more in the same handful of valleys, in the same handful of months. That's not luck happening twice. That's two operations built on decades of combined experience, heavy machinery, and the willingness to take calculated risks when the ground demanded it. Now let's talk about the other side of this story, because while Parker and Tony were trading friendly jabs over who found more gold, Rick Ness was fighting a completely different battle just to keep his season alive. Rick's trouble didn't come from a single bad decision. It came from the ground itself, refusing to cooperate. At his site, known as the Valhalla Cut, his crew hit something every miner dreads: a thick layer of clay roughly 30 feet deep. Clay like that isn't just annoying to dig through. It's often a sign that whatever paid dirt exists underneath is going to be difficult or impossible to reach before the season runs out. For Rick, that layer effectively closed the door on Valhalla Cut as a realistic option for the rest of the year. Imagine investing weeks of planning, fuel, and crew hours into a claim, only to hit a wall of clay that tells you, in no uncertain terms, that this ground isn't going to pay off this season. That's not a hypothetical for Rick. That's exactly what happened. With Valhalla effectively dead, Rick's last realistic option was a site called Vegas Valley, ground that had actually saved his season before in a previous year with a $2 million payoff. But Vegas Valley came with its own complicated history. 7 weeks earlier that same season, Rick had been forced to pull the plug on operations there entirely because of safety concerns on the ground. Anyone who spent time around placer mining knows that safety pauses aren't small inconveniences. When a site gets flagged for ground stability or safety risk, work doesn't just slow down, it stops completely until the situation is addressed. Every idle hour on a stopped claim is an hour where fuel costs, equipment rental, and crew wages keep draining the budget with zero gold coming out of the ground to offset it. For an operation the size of Rick's, that kind of stoppage isn't a minor setback. It's the kind of financial hit that can define whether an entire season ends in profit or in the red. Once his water license for Vegas Valley was extended, Rick made the call to throw everything he had left into that one claim. Not some of his resources, everything. It was, by his own admission, a sink or swim scenario. There was no backup plan behind door number 3. If Vegas Valley didn't produce, there was no other site left to save the season. That's about as high stakes as placer mining gets, especially when you're watching 2 other operations a few valleys over pulling tens of millions of dollars while you're betting your entire year on one last claim. To his credit, Rick didn't do it alone. He got a boost from a friend and fellow miner, Brian Zaremba, who came in to help push the operation forward during the final stretch. Equipment failures kept testing the crew's patience along the way, the kind of grinding mechanical problems that eat entire shifts without producing a single ounce of gold. At one point, one of Rick's own mechanics openly wondered whether it was worth staying on for the rest of the season or heading home to be with family instead. That's the kind of detail that tells you how close to the edge this operation was running. When your own crew starts questioning whether it's worth finishing the year, you know the pressure is real. So here's where the 2 stories really diverge. And it's not the ending you might expect if all you'd heard was the headline. Rick Ness did not lose everything. His crew pushed through the equipment failures, pushed through the memory of a safety shutdown earlier in the season, and pushed through betting the entire year on one last claim. By the time the season wrapped, Rick had actually surpassed his goal of 1,800 ounces, finishing with just over 1,811 ounces of gold. It wasn't $40 million. It wasn't even close to what Parker or Tony brought in. But it was a real result, earned the hard way, after a season that genuinely could have ended in total failure. That's what makes this story worth telling honestly instead of exaggerating it into something it wasn't. Parker Schnabel's season was extraordinary by any measure, built on months of preparation, calculated risk-taking when yields dipped, and the resources to deploy new equipment exactly when it mattered most. Tony Beets ran an equally impressive operation right alongside him, ultimately claiming the season's top spot. And Rick Ness, despite hitting one of the worst possible outcomes early in the year, a safety-driven shutdown on his best claim followed by a dead end of clay on his backup site, still found a way to claw his way to a positive result by putting everything on the line at Vegas Valley. There's a temptation in this industry, and honestly in this whole genre of content, to turn every season into pure black and white. One guy wins everything, another guy loses everything, roll credits. But placer mining rarely works that cleanly. The ground doesn't care about your narrative. It doesn't care about your budget, your crew's morale, or how good your season looked on paper back in January. Parker's ground happened to reward patience and heavy investment in the right spot at the right time. Rick's ground punished him early with clay and a safety shutdown then gave him just enough at the very end to walk away with something instead of nothing. What ties both stories together isn't luck, and it isn't disaster either. It's the fact that every single decision made on that ground, whether it was Parker's choice to shut down plants and chase the Golden Mile, or Rick's choice to gamble everything on Vegas Valley after already losing 7 weeks to a safety pause, came from people who understood the risk and made the call anyway. That's what separates operations that survive a brutal season from ones that don't. Not the size of the equipment, not even the size of the check at the end. It's the willingness to keep making hard calls when the ground gives you every reason to walk away. So when you hear people talk about this season like it was simply Parker winning and Rick losing, remember what actually happened underground. One operation had the resources and the timing to turn a good claim into a record-breaking one. Another operation got hit with a legitimate safety shutdown and a dead-end layer of clay. And instead of folding, bet its entire remaining season on one last claim and pulled through with a real, if modest, result. Both of those are stories worth respecting. Neither one needed to be exaggerated into something it wasn't to be worth your time. If this kind of deep dive into what's actually happening on the ground, beyond the headlines and the dramatic titles, is something you want more of, make sure you're subscribed because next season is already shaping up to bring its own set of hard calls, close calls, and ground that refuses to give up its gold without a fight.